California Citrus State Historic Park. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about our newest exhibit, Finding Ourselves in the Groves, and in particular one aspect that focuses on budding landscapes, African Americans, and citrus. So did you know that African Americans were involved in the citrus industry and that they were in fact community leaders and very prominent citizens in our local region? For example, Israel Beale was a grove owner in Redlands. He owned nearly 60 acres of groves, and he also helped fund a local newspaper called The Colored Citizen. David Stokes was also another very prominent citizen in Riverside and Redlands. He was an entrepreneur and had a general store just a few blocks from the park here today. And this is actually the store pictured here. So this is just a little preview to give you a sense of the African American involvement in the citrus industry. But please enjoy this extended presentation of my research for the Relevancy History Project and African American involvement in citrus.
Southern California natives who have grown up surrounded by citrus lore have undoubtedly heard the story of Eliza Tibbets watering the first Washington navel orange trees with her dirty dishwater. If you're really in the know, you might have even heard about the Chinese, Japanese, and Mexican laborers who helped take that tree and turn its fruit into a multi-billion-dollar industry. But have you heard of John B. Adams, Israel Beale, Horace Harrell, or David Stokes? Did you know that African Americans were not only an instrumental part of the workforce during the development of Riverside's citrus industry, but also owned and managed their own incredibly lucrative orange groves? The Inland Empire's citrus landscape once stretched thousands of acres in every direction, but the increase of housing and commercial developments over the course of the 20th century has led to the collapse of that landscape. With this collapse has also come the erasure of the stories of those who labored in the groves. Preservation practices that encompass retelling old narratives through new information, as well as those that push to use social histories for preservation when there is not necessarily an intact building, object, or landscape to preserve in traditional terms, can help preserve memory, place, and space by uncovering and then highlighting these hidden histories. In exploring African American histories of migration from southern states to California just a few decades after the end of the Civil War, our research has uncovered many of the hidden histories of Black involvement in the citrus industries of Redlands, Riverside, and the surrounding Inland Empire region, as just one of many economic opportunities that existed for African Americans in the West. We strive in this project to represent the region's diverse cultural heritage as well as the historic landscape of citrus, while exploring the roles and relationships of well-known African Americans in the citrus industry. Our research is particularly timely as the City of Riverside has recently won a civil rights grant from the National Park Service to, quote, focus on filling the holes left by previous research, survey, documentation, and designation efforts of African American community resources. By using the idea of preserving memories without sites to publicly acknowledge histories that are not apparent to the public eye, how are these efforts about changing the landscapes that ought to be preserved to reconfigure how we understand their construction in terms of race, economics, social power, and agency? The Inland Empire did not see a large number of African Americans in the citrus industry as compared to other racial groups, but perhaps because of this small number, those that were in the field became connected through various religious, social, and political organizations. Based on the frequency of reporting on their accomplishments in The Colored Citizen, an African American-run newspaper produced out of Redlands in 1905 and 1906, it is clear that the Orange Ranchers were the most prominent members of the Black community. Though none were native to California and likely came to the state to escape the racial violence of the South and to have the opportunity for economic independence, they left a lasting legacy on the region through their participation in the citrus industry. While Eliza Tibbets is often credited with starting the industry that would later make Riverside one of the richest cities in the country, she did not do it alone. After traveling from North Carolina to Los Angeles to work on Lucky Baldwin's ranch, John B. Adams flourished as a horticulturalist and budder, or someone who grafts budwood onto existing rootstock to create new trees. Oral histories suggest that he assisted Eliza Tibbets with grafting the parent navel orange trees in the late 1880s. Although Adams is not mentioned by name in the article shown here, his granddaughters Eunice Lisburg, Helen Armstrong, and Thelma King explain that after being born into slavery as Hicks Bundy in 1860s Carolinas, John B. Adams traveled to California as a free man in order to participate as contracted labor on Baldwin's Monrovia Ranch, where he would settle and raise a family. His green thumb was well known in the area as he fostered many of the plants still on the grounds of the Los Angeles Arboretum. In this sense, African Americans were an active part of the citrus industry from its birth and continued to contribute to its success through its peak into the 1940s. There are a few references in the Riverside census records to African Americans being laborers on orange ranches, as is the case of David P. Riggins, an orange picker in 1900, and Thomas Milford and Albert Coles Jr., orange ranch laborers in 1910. However, there are dozens of references to African Americans in Redlands and Riverside as simply laborers, and it is completely reasonable to assume that some of these men would have been working in the groves and packing houses, picking and packing the citrus fruit. One example is Miles H. Henderson, who came from Texas and bought a home in Redlands. He was the trusted rancher of a multimillionaire citrus grove owner. Another is Robert Jonigan, who migrated from Georgia with his wife Fanny to work as a butter of citrus trees in Riverside. Many African American families owned homes adjacent to picturesque citrus groves. Mr. and Mrs. F. H. Shafter bought their Redlands home at 425 East 10th Street. Just blocks from the downtown area where Mr. Shafter worked as a barber, their property had orange trees and a walkway through their orchard. In Riverside, Moses Bacon also owned a home surrounded by fruit trees. The Colored Citizen promoted a very positive view of these two towns, noting, "Many of our people have purchased and live in their own homes. Redlands has no boom on, but it is steadily improving in every direction. The delightful climatic character and educational conditions existent here make it a most desirable place for home seekers. Riverside is also truly a progressive city." There is evidence that a handful of African Americans also owned orange ranches throughout the region. For example, in August 1905, the paper boasted, "Reverend A. Simpson is one of Riverside's oldest and most substantial citizens. From his orange ranch upon which his large two-story house sits, he realizes quite a sum." 10 years earlier, in nearby Redlands, Horace Harrell purchased a $12,000 orange ranch near Crofton and earned enough profit from his groves that he paid off his mortgage in just 1 year. He would later use his citrus profits to fund the Colored Citizen's 2-year run, perhaps explaining the paper's interest in the groves and grove owners of the region. These images of his Redlands home, built in 1911, give us a sense of the wealth that a citrus grove could provide its owner at this time. Another individual about whom we have learned much is Harrell's good friend Israel Beale, who himself was one of the most influential African Americans in the Inland Empire, and who built his citrus empire a mere half-mile from Harrell's home. Born into slavery in 1849 Virginia, Israel Beale was one of the earliest African American settlers to the Redlands area in the 1870s. 2 decades earlier, in 1851, a group of 26 slaves had arrived with a caravan of 500 Mormons who hoped to settle in Southern California. 2 of these early black settlers, Toby and Hannah Embers, married after arriving in California and later had a daughter, Martha, in 1855. California native Martha Embers would marry Israel Beale in 1870. During this time, Beale continued to work on Myron H. Craft's Orange Ranch in Redlands before purchasing the land on which he and Martha would build their Redlands home in 1877. The home was built in 1886, and the first known image of the structure appeared in the Colored Citizen in July 1905. One of the first African Americans to own property in the area and called one of the leading horticulturalists in his neighborhood by the Colored Citizen, Beale was one of very few African American grove owners with 60 acres of land to his name. Redlands was a new town and had 2,500 acres of fruit lands. Israel Beale was among a group of individuals that owned that tract of land. According to an article in the Pacific Rural Press dated August 26, 1882, owners of the tract are energetic men who leave no stone unturned to make their enterprise a success. They do not try to figure out how little they can do and sell their land, but where they can put another $1,000 and make the tract more desirable to first-class settlers. In addition to trying to draw more settlers to the region, Beale was also an investor and co-director of the Ligonia Fruit Packing Company, started by Redlands City founders E.G. Judson and Frank E. Brown, and which specialized in peaches and apricots. He also helped develop the future University of Redlands campus by planting peaches, apricots, and other small fruits, noting, "We didn't think we could grow oranges." At this point in our research, it is unclear when the Beale home was raised, and the site is now a vacant lot. However, we do have a 1953 image of the rear of the house, in which you'll note the mature citrus trees surrounding it, otherwise remarkably unchanged from its original form. As an emblem for health and prosperity in the region, owning a successful citrus grove provided Israel Beale not only economic capital, but also signaled his social and cultural capital in the Redlands community. Today, his legacy is embodied by a park named in his honor in North Redlands. In addition to their friendship as neighboring grove owners, Horace Harrell and Israel Beale were both members of the San Bernardino Lodge fraternity. Their wives, Rachel Harrell and Martha Beale, were involved in the Orange Blossom chapter of the Household of Ruth, which was an organization in which Miles Henderson's wife, Sophia, also participated. Further, Harrell was the president of the local Afro-American League, Beale was vice president, and Henderson was on the executive committee. The Harrells and Beals were also members of the AME Church in Redlands, of which Riverside Grove owner Reverend Augustus Simpson was pastor for 3 years. This photo shows the Hendersons sitting in front of their Redlands home. Though we know the exact location of the Harrell family home, the proximate location of the Beale family home, it is unclear where the Henderson home was located. It is in cases like this where, although we don't have a building to draw stories from, we've been able to piece together a larger narrative of relationships and community using what we do have, photographs and newspapers, in order to preserve memory, place, and space. Like many others who would follow, David Stokes first arrived in Riverside on the endorsement of a relative, his uncle, Robert Stokes, who had migrated to the area by 1880 and later became the first African-American policeman in the region. Like Israel Beale in Redlands, David Stokes worked as a laborer in various capacities before saving enough money to start his business. The Stokes family were leaders in the Riverside community, and their impact is recorded in various newspaper accounts, as well as oral histories. Similar to Beale helping to develop the land of the future University of Redlands, first-generation Riversider Oscar Stokes helped his father David Stokes with planting the first Washington navel orange trees 10 years later on the grounds of the now world-famous University of California Riverside Citrus Experiment Station in 1917. He vividly remembered, "The ground was so hard we had to blast holes in it." There is additional anecdotal evidence that African Americans would have been employed by the citrus station as laborers in various capacities like planting and picking, and this is one area of research that will be further explored in this continuing project using the citrus station's employment records in UCR's special collections. Based on census data, a concentration of African American families ultimately settled in the east side neighborhood of Riverside, which also housed the multiracial labor force of the citrus industry in the early 20th century. Among those whose entrepreneurship we find evidence of within the Black community, David Stokes stands out as instrumental in the construction of Mercantile Hall in Eastside, which would also house the Stokes and Wiley grocery store, pictured here in 1912. The Colored Citizen enthusiastically covered the progression of Stokes' business ventures, and Stokes had an ad in nearly every issue that was produced in the paper's 2-year run. The December 1906 issue even noted, D.S. Stokes is doing quite a prosperous business among the people of the East Side. In addition to their interactions through the Colored Citizen and perhaps in their shared stories of laboring in the region's groves, David Stokes would have known Israel Beale and Horace Harrell because of community events held in the Mercantile Hall building in Riverside. By connecting with community members like John B. Adams's granddaughters Eunice and Helen, our findings have produced new conclusions about what we know and thought we knew about Black communities in the Inland Empire. For instance, through the combination of oral histories, newspaper accounts, census records, and other archival materials, we do not see African Americans only as exploited labor, but as economically independent grove owners whose agricultural self-sustenance made them influential members of their communities. We can now say their names and share their stories. These stories are important and site-based. They are fundamentally about the preservation of buildings and landscapes and the social histories about both. They are about publicly preserving and interpreting histories that have been pushed below the surface in favor of citrus celebrations and a citrus imaginary that privileges white heroism and mastery over nature and a subordinated racialized workforce. Our research attempts to preserve the integrity and agency of people who were not part of that heroic narrative, but who also were not part of the exploited elements of that same narrative. Through this project, we have aimed to preserve their voice and their landscape, and in the process of doing the work, have memorialized a different kind of citrus landscape. Thank you.